Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Readsy. So in today's video, I'm going to be reacting to Elmore Leonard's 10 writing rules. So if you've never heard of Elmore Leonard, to be honest, I wasn't really that familiar with him. He was a crime and thriller writer who's known for his influence in the genre, and he was also known for his essay on kind of these 10 golden rules for writing that he believed in and followed. So today I'm going to be breaking down his 10 rules, giving you my take on them. I haven't looked at the rules beforehand, so I don't know what they are. No matter what my take is on these rules, obviously they work for some people because they clearly worked for him and he was a very influential person in the genre. I think really the only thing I don't believe in writing rules is absolutes, you know, a rule that's like never do this or always do this. Maybe isn't that effective, but if you just remove the always or remove the never, it might be. Everyone writes different style of work, has different goals with their work, and has their own unique writing process, so it's very hard to have any kind of absolute writing rule. Really, if a writing rule resonates with you and it makes your work better or closer to what you want it to be, then it's a great one to follow. So today I'm just gonna be giving you my take on these 10 writing rules, even though rules don't really exist in writing. So the first rule is never open a book with weather. I think there is truth to this statement for two reasons. First of all, it's a very easy thing to fall back on, describing weather as your opener. The weather is almost never the most interesting thing in a scene, so it's rarely the most attention-grabbing thing to begin with. I do think describing the weather can have its place for creating mood, for creating atmosphere, setting the scene. I don't think it's bad to describe weather. I describe weather, to be honest, probably more than I should in my work. You know, for a chapter every once in a while, probably fine, but for a piece, opening a book or a short story with the weather, it probably is good to push yourself to see if there's something more interesting. This is a pretty specific piece of advice that also picks up on a pretty common impulse. His second rule is avoid prologues. We actually have a whole video on this, on prologues, and one of the main questions in that video was, is it okay to have a prologue? I think prologues are fine. Personally, I think that the hate on prologues is a little over-exaggerated. You'll hear it said all the time to never write a book with a prologue. You know, agents and editors hate prologues. How many published books have prologues? So many. They're so common. If they were so hated, I think you wouldn't be seeing them anymore. In a lot of genres, they're expected. You know, if you pick up a high fantasy novel, you can almost expect there to be a prologue. You have to think carefully about a prologue and use it with intention and really make sure that it's contributing and adding to the piece. But I really don't think prologues are this great sin that they're sometimes made out to be. I think, like with anything, they can be used well or they can be used poorly. I think with a prologue, it just stands out a lot more if it's used poorly because it's the first thing you read and it usually stands separately from the rest of the story in some way. So that really makes it stick out if it's not effective. So the third rule here is never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. This is good advice. I think the never is a bit strong. Said should be your most common dialogue tag. There was this trend, at least in schools, I don't know about in the writing community, but I remember this when I was in elementary school, so this would have been like 15 years ago. I don't know if they still teach this way. When they were teaching us to write, the saying was, said is dead. So they would literally teach us to use anything other than said because said has been overused, and then they revised that because they thought that dead was too harsh a word to use in a saying to teach children how to write, so they changed it to said is exhausted. Said is not exhausted, said is still going strong. I think that the writing community and hopefully educators have gotten past the said is dead phase and realize that it's actually, in most cases, the best dialogue tag to use. Never seems a bit strong. I would say there are other dialogue tags that are also invisible. Whispered is pretty invisible, asked is pretty invisible, shouted or yelled is pretty invisible. Those four can probably be 95% of your dialogue tags, with said making up the majority of them. Those figures are obviously just off the top of my head and you don't actually have to do the math there. Readers won't notice said, and it allows the dialogue to speak for itself. The best way to think of dialogue tags is as a form of punctuation rather than words. So it's actually a case where you want less interest in words, so the dialogue is what pops in the sentence. So the next rule is never use an adverb to modify the verb said. He admonished gravely. That's the kind of thing that came from the said is dead era of teaching. dialogue tags like that. I think this is good to pair with the previous piece of advice. If you're like, okay, I can only use said, but then in order to only use said, you just start using adverbs to modify said, it's defeating the point of only using said. So said can usually stand on its own. Every once in a while, of course, you can use an adverb to modify a dialogue tag, you know, but use it when it counts. The next golden rule here is keep your exclamation points under control. You are allowed no more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words of prose. So that's in the average novel. That means that you're getting, you know, around 2 exclamation marks. For the most part, exclamation marks aren't necessary and kind of have the opposite effect that they're meant to. They're meant to show shock, surprise, but a lot of the time they can kind of cheapen a line of dialogue. They can make it seem less serious. I remember writing a scene where characters were shouting once, and I used exclamation points because they were shouting, and reading it back, it read so childishly with all the exclamation points, so I removed them, made the scene actually feel more intense without the exclamation mark. So I do think in general, you don't need many exclamation marks. When I use an exclamation mark in my work, it's almost always sarcastically. Keep your exclamation marks in check is good advice. I don't think you have to actually crunch the numbers and make sure that you are only using 3 in your entire novel, but just like with anything, use them with intention when they create a certain effect, and do be aware that sometimes they have the opposite effect intended. Exclamation marks often don't make a line of dialogue more intense, they make it seem more childish. So that's a way that you can use them intentionally, but I do think it is good to keep them in check, especially if you're going for a more serious or mature tone. The next rule that he's got here is never use the words suddenly or all hell broke loose. I think this is good advice. First of all hell broke loose is a pretty cliched phrase. The word suddenly is almost always redundant because if something happens suddenly, rather than being told it was sudden, we'll just see it happening suddenly. It wasn't happening before, now it's happening. And when you add the word suddenly, it actually takes away the impact. The sentence actually has more punch and therefore feels more sudden without the word suddenly. Number 7 is to use regional dialect sparingly. I think that this depends on 2 factors: your familiarity with the regional dialect and, of course, your intention for the piece. In most cases, you don't and really shouldn't be writing out regional dialects in dialogue. It can make it seem like you're mocking the character's accent or dialect, but there are pretty successful novels that are written in a dialect. I'm thinking of Milkman by Anna Burns, which won the Man Booker a couple years ago. So it can definitely be used well. This is one of those cases where it's kind of all or nothing. You're either gonna lean into it super heavily, probably because this is a dialect you yourself grew up around, probably speak, are very familiar with. I do think that in a way this is an almost all or nothing thing. It's either a pretty big stylistic choice that you make and really lean into and really commit to, or it's something that's better to just avoid. So I do think that there's some wisdom to this. In most cases, you probably don't need it unless you're making a very intentional stylistic choice for your piece. Number 8 is avoid detailed descriptions of characters. Finally, I have one that I can disagree with, though I think that it depends on your definition of detailed. And that's one of those things that can kind of get lost in translation with rules like this. What do you mean by detailed? Maybe he meant like a full page, multiple paragraphs, in which case, in most cases, you don't need a super detailed description of a character. But if by detailed he means a paragraph, a couple well-constructed sentences, in that case, I would disagree. I think character descriptions can actually be very effective. As a reader, I like getting them. I like being able to see a character's face really vividly. I'm the type of reader, if you don't tell me what a character looks like, I will just see a blur. I like to be told what people look like. I like to see faces. I think of it as like acting. If you were watching a movie or you're watching a show, part of what's gonna make that piece impactful is the actor's facial expressions and being able to see their movement and their expressions. So I think being able to see face, being able to see characters' bodies can actually be super effective. So personally, I like detailed descriptions of characters. Obviously, you don't want to go overboard. A couple strong sentences that are interesting descriptions that pick out interesting traits can add a lot to a piece. Not every single character needs to be described in detail, but personally, I like detailed descriptions of characters. I think from a writer's perspective, I think that you can do a lot with a character description. I like to know what I'm looking at, And so I like to be told what characters look like so I can actually picture them and picture their expressions and picture their faces in the scene. His next one is don't go into great detail describing places and things. And again, I think it probably depends on what his definition of great detail is. Personally, I like description and I like pretty descriptive writing. And it's something that as a reader, I really enjoy good description. I like to feel immersed in the story. I like to be shown interesting, vivid images. Again, it depends on his definition of great detail. Or does he mean excessive description, you know, going on for pages and pages describing a single room, doing that in almost every scene? Yeah, that would probably be too much. But I think that a generous amount of description is fine if it's within your style and it's something that you enjoy. The final rule here is try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. This is good advice. One of my favorite writing tips, something that has always resonated with me since I first heard it, was if the reader can imagine it happening without you telling them it happened, then you don't need to include it. Of course, the tricky part with this advice is what exactly does he mean by stuff that people tend to skip? Different people skip different stuff. Like I was just saying, I love a nice detailed description. For some people, that might be among the stuff that they tend to skip. So this is a matter of perspective, but I think in general, as a writer, you're writing for readers who have similar tastes to you, right? You're writing work that you enjoy. Your target audience probably likes work in a similar style on similar topics in a similar genre that you tend to like. So the stuff that you find boring and you tend to skip is probably also the stuff that much of your target audience finds boring and would tend to skip. It requires some better judgment because you have to be able to identify things that people would probably skip and that the story doesn't need. But I do think if you have that sense about a scene, about a paragraph, oh, I think readers would skip this because it's not necessary, and that is probably a sign that it can go. All right, so those are Elmore Leonard's 10 writing rules. I think he has a whole long essay that actually goes into depth on all of these things. This was just my reaction to the 10 different points. In general, I think a lot of these are good rules of thumb. I do think that they're phrased in a pretty black and white way. Never do this, always avoid this. When pretty much everything is a matter of better judgment, there really isn't anything in writing that you should never do. And if you're avoiding something in your work or you're doing something in your work and the only reason is, well, I've been told to never do this or I've been told to always do this, then you're not really doing that with intentionality, right? It should be, okay, I'm not going to do this because it wouldn't be right for the piece. I'm going to include this thing because it would help my piece. That really is the most important thing in writing, is applying rules as they benefit your piece. And if they don't benefit your piece, maybe you don't want to apply them. So with any kind of set of rules like this, they can be helpful, they can be good to keep in mind, they can clue you into new things. Oh, maybe I am using too many adverbs in my dialogue tags. Maybe I am going into too much description. But there is no set of rules that you have to follow every single time. It's all about applying them when you think it would actually help your piece. So thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time, bye.